Hi everybody, welcome again and to our final session of the conference. We've got yet another amazing panel. Are you ready? We've had some scary afternoons at this conference, I can tell you, and I'm a little bit nervous now looking at the lineup here. Before we do, and of course afterwards, I'm just going to say a few words, a few thank yous, and then we'll let you go home. But before then, we've got quite a session in front of us. A little bit of background to this event, this particular panel, just to explain. It's a little bit different to what you'd normally have at a conference, I think, deliberately so. And I wanted to explain because I think I had a bit of a hand in its creation and caused a bit of grief amongst the team. But they played along with me, which I'm very grateful for, and these kind people on the stage have also played along with me, so that's great. So as the director of the Australian Institute of Family Studies, you won't be surprised to hear that I spend most of my days thinking about families. And one of the things I've noticed is that I often get branded or categorised as either very religious and or a far-right conservative, which is a little bit unsettling for me personally. And then last year, of course, those of us who were here in Australia last year will remember, we had the national survey on marriage legislation and the subsequent vote on the same-sex marriage, and that brought something very private into the public gaze. It was, I don't know if you've forgotten how big that was, but it was such a big thing for so many months. And of course, at the end, we had tears and applause and impromptu singing in Parliament. And, I remember thinking it was an exceptional moment in social policy reform, actually. Something, I don't think we've ever had singing in Parliament in Australia. So it was quite a big deal. And for those of us who are interested in social policy, this was quite a big deal. But this came after a period of very heated and often very hurtful arguments. And that preceding period of public debate was quite ugly. We had some advocates claiming the territory of so-called family values as a reason to maintain or a justification to maintain the status quo. And the Yes campaign tended to focus more on individual rights. And that really bothered me as the director of the Institute. So this was very ugly and so, and it coincided with us thinking about the conference and what we should have happen at the conference. And it just seemed to me that if we didn't go to this place of talking about the family and inviting perhaps the question of is there a new conversation about family that we can have, then we would be remiss. It is our role to do this, and I know that this audience has strong feelings about this, as do I. Different feelings, we all have different ideas and so forth, but I think, we're all here and we've spent 3 days thinking about the family. So I guess the question really is it inevitable that the idea of family will forever be contested territory? What do we think about that? We've spent 3 days thinking about what matters most to families in the 21st century, but really does it matter? Is it the wrong question? I don't know. And I guess what we've done here is invited some people who will have ideas and experiences to share with you on this question. And I'd like to now hand over to Madonna King, who I've introduced to you before, to introduce our fantastic panel. Thank you, Madonna.
Thanks, Anne, and we like that you're causing grief, and we hope to add to that a little bit more this afternoon. In addition to this big piece of social reform that Anne's referred to, that's also allowed a conversation about the makeup and the roles of the family, so long treated as the base currency of our social economy. In agreeing that mum and dad are not the only legal form of marital relationship, we also throw open the question of what else a modern family looks like and is it central to society's functioning. This is a good conversation because the reality, even before the same-sex marriage vote, was that a high proportion of families were blended headed by a sole parent, and an increasing proportion of families were centred around same-sex couples. It's also a good time to have this conversation. We live in disruptive times where technology has changed behaviours in both a positive and a negative way. But it also means almost anything is up for grabs as we shed some of the certainties that have failed us in the past and look at new ways of thinking and behaving which will succeed in the future. And the stellar panel, we've all met Nora Spinks, the CEO of the Vanier Institute of the Family in Canada. Is there anyone in the room who doesn't know Benjamin Law? No? All right, Benjamin Law. Ron Mock, a Jugan man and a member of the Yaru people. He's CEO of the Loitcha Institute. Jono Nichols, the founding member of Reach Out. And Jamila Rizvi, an author, presenter, columnist. I'm sure you know Jamila, and she's just got her second book out, Motherhood, which will be really relevant to today's discussion. So I introduced you last, Jamila, so I'm going to start with you. Oh, God. Just in a few words.
I sat in the middle.
And I looked where you sat. In a few words, define family for me.
Oh, let's start easy, shall we? Well, I'm going to go to the personal, if that's all right. I think because family to me is a very broad definition. And I think I've recently gone through that transition where my traditional family, I always thought of it as my mum and dad, my sister and I, that was our nuclear family. And now becoming a mother myself, starting to realise that, oh, no, family is shifting a bit. That central idea of my nuclear family is now my partner and I and our little boy. But I genuinely don't think about family day to day in such a narrow way because I see the three of us living here in Melbourne together and all of my blood relatives live interstate or overseas. I see it as something different. I see it as our group of friends. I see it as those who are supporting us, who are interconnected with us, those who we see most day to day.
All right, so can I go to you, Benjamin? You're nodding your head there. How different is the definition of family to you growing up as a young boy in Queensland to now?
So I grew up in a nuclear family that was very, very big. My parents migrated here from Hong Kong and they did what migrants do very well when they reach a new country, which is breed a lot. I'm one of 5 kids and like you know, that was my concept of the family growing up. Mum, dad, 5 kids. My parents divorced when I was quite young, so already we were kind of thrust into like a new iteration of what a family looked like and how we were seen and how we behaved, I guess. But you know, skip forward to 2018 and it makes me think of on Saturday, I was at a kid's birthday party because I'm in my mid-30s, so I'm in the prime breeding years of me and my peers' life. You know, it's breeding season amongst my friends. And so I'm surrounded by kids on a daily basis. My boyfriend and I don't have kids, but we have so many kids in our lives, whether they're god kids or just kids that we've grown up with, and we'll see them grow up. And when I looked at this particular birthday party, my 3-year-old little mate, she has 2 mums. They are both from different ethnic backgrounds. One mum is Anglo, one mum is Vietnamese Australian. Her donor was also there and she knows him as her donor. Both sets of grandparents were there, speaking a multitude of languages. The guests had, as I could tell, Anglo, Asian, African and Indigenous Australian background. Like it was basically Lyle Shelton's worst nightmare. And for me, it was a very pleasant morning. But it did strike me that I could not have kind of even fathomed that kind of gathering when I was growing up.
Okay, so just listening to what Ben's saying, Nora, to you, we've seen the disruption with Uber, with Airbnb. Is family going through a similar type of disruption, or has the meaning of it been watered down so much that it is just a useless word now? It doesn't mean anything.
Well, I don't know where this quote came from originally, but I think it's very appropriate for this conversation. And this was, family is where you learn to get along with people that don't share your interests and where you learn all about the process of aging. And I think that sort of allows us to step back a little bit. Now, at the Vanier Institute, we went through a rebranding process a little while ago, and we came up with a logo that's about a snowflake, because we couldn't come up with an image that was anything other than something that's unique, that's influenced by the environment. That's how your shape gets formed. You have one snowflake and it's just one snowflake. You can get a snowbank. You could get an ice, like everything changes when you start thinking about family as being that which is self-defined. It's dynamic and ever-changing, and it's vital to the individual, but it's also important for the collective.
Okay,
And
so
sometimes you need to freeze someone out.
Yes. Absolutely.
no, don't say sorry. That's the line so far, but I'm sure Benjamin will beat you by the end of that. Or he's trying now. Look, Rom, can I just pick up on what Nora said then? Particularly 2 words. She said unique and influenced by the environment. Family is important, but for Indigenous families in particular, it can't really be separated from both culture and connection to land, can it? Explain that to us.
No, that's right. And I mean, as we sit here, we're in this sort of this built environment, but what we've got to do is to look below the surface. So when we think about the 230 years of European occupation in this our sovereign lands, that's about 9 generations. We think about the 65,000 years, that's 2,600 generations. So it's almost a kind of artifice to think about culture and family, or culture and identity, because our identities are built upon our relationship with our ancestors, with Mother Earth, with our totems, our spirit, and this connectedness. So it's not just about a temporal or approximate kind of concept. With me here today are my ancestors, for example, and I know that. So that goes back from the beginning of time. Yeah. So this notion of a construct of a family and the debates around that are, in a sense, a nonsense to me. It doesn't make sense to me in any form whatsoever.
So going on from that, I guess, to you, Jono, should we define families by action, by what they do, rather than where you're born?
Probably the simplest definition of the simplest definition of family for me is probably someone who's willing to pick you up from the airport.
I'm going to test that out later tonight.
Unfortunately, a whole bunch of people are going, actually, my husband and wife don't necessarily do that often. But I think what you really got at the heart of it is actually two different... One, which is we all have an image in our head of what we want family to be. And that's very emotive. It's actually, for me, fundamentally, that someone will just love me for me. Yeah. And if they love me for me, they're my family. Because there is no transactional relationship in that idea that they love me for me. Now, all of us, including me, working for a mental health service, actually, a lot of our profession is working with people whose that promise has been broken. Yeah. And that's the distress, that our ideal of family, however we define it and however many people we bring into it, is they will love me for me. And then when the person who you thought embodied that betrays that trust, then that breaks you psychologically. And unfortunately, I think that's what we all kind of battle with, and really as providers, in many senses, try and put those pieces of that puzzle back together again.
And that's what we've been talking about a lot in the last couple of days. And a term that keeps coming up is family values, Nora. And I'm wondering, is it quite an exclusive term? It's not actually inclusive.
Well, what we do at the Institute whenever the topic comes up of family values is we flip it around and say, how do we value families in all of their diversity, and respect and honor whatever you choose to be your family. And if we want to make sure that everybody has access to opportunities and reaches their full potential and has the support that they need in order to be the best they can be, whether it's an individual, a partner, a parent, a grandparent, to be a community member, then we're doing our job.
I'm going to come back to you about the importance of language a little bit later, because that's an example, isn't it? But, you know, if I can pick up on something Anne said in her introduction, Benjamin, in the debate about same-sex marriage, you had most of Australia and the gay population arguing on individual rights, and you had the religious right arguing on family values.
Yep.
Did you give family values over to them? Is it hard to be pro-gay and pro-family now?
It's interesting. I mean, I wasn't formally part of the Yes campaign, but of course that's the side of the debate that I was on. And it was interesting to watch, I thought, as an outsider to the campaign itself, that it was placed on individual rights, because what I think they must have been doing strategy-wise was presenting the least scary version of same-sex marriage to the population. Because even though same-sex marriage is really asking Australians one thing, do you approve of same-sex couples getting married, it was kind of used as a broader metric for same-sex acceptance or LGBTIQ acceptance, which isn't what it was at all. Because I think if you ask the question, do you think it's right for same-sex couples to raise children, then we'd probably get a different response. If you ask Australians, do you think it's okay for transgender people to teach your children at school, you would get a different response together. There are all these different levels of fear that are lobbed towards LGBTIQ people in Australia. And same-sex marriage, they wanted one goal, we wanted one goal, which was that same-sex people could get married in the country. So that's what everyone just needed to be completely myopically focused on by necessity, I think.
It was strategic.
I think so.
Okay, so let's come to that. You know, Jono, when you walk up the escalator downstairs and you come to the Australian Institute of Family Studies sign, it's grandma, granddad, mum, dad and this gorgeous little boy. But in the last 2 days, we haven't talked much about that family. Are we better off forgetting family policy and focusing on individuals?
No.
More information. We're not.
There'd be a lot of people out of a job if we did that. But look, and I think because I get back to that central point is what is the wounding that happens when someone who you believed to love you for you betrays that? And that's why families are important, right? Because if they were unimportant, that wounding wouldn't be that significant. We meet a lot of people in our life who don't love us for who we are, who actually aren't very nice to us, and we actually move past those people relatively quickly. We freeze them out, to use kind of Jamila's term, and it's a pretty comfortable process. But the why are families in how we construct it and this debate really important is because they are emotionally important to us, and that's because human beings are genetically hardwired as social animals with our relationships to each other at the heart of it. And if you remove that, you end up intellectualising what is fundamentally a emotional process that goes to the deep part of our brain.
In policy terms too, so family should still be the target.
So I think, so the question being, are they unimportant? No, right? Does that mean that we can't have lots of other conversations around them and have these sorts of debates? Yes, but I think I keep coming back to, if you ask everyone on the street, including us, what is important, most important in their life, an image and a story pops up in their head, which is their family, however they construct it. And that's why it's important.
All right, so I'm going to go to Jamila, who has written family policy for government, haven't you? Yeah. And as a single person working in Canberra, I would be annoyed every time because everything was for the families. Nothing was ever for the individuals. As public servants or as strategists sitting down to write family policy around family values, what's the little picture you had on your desk to remind you? Like, what was the target?
That's a complex question. Also, I think when I was working in Canberra, I was single with no children. So I was one of those people who, I remember when the Rudd government first came to power, who I worked for, we talked about the working family, and we talked about working families constantly. And I was like, it was such a great set of buzzwords. Well done, us. And I don't remember the date where I went, oh, I'm a working family now. They're trying to get my vote now. But I mean, the reason we used working families was because working families were the majority of voters.
What is a working family?
That's exactly the point, right? When you're in political messaging, it's about making as many people as possible feel included in the majority that you are talking to, and that was enough where the people you were excluding weren't going to throw a vote either way. To be honest, like that's the baseline that consideration comes down to.
Rom, you're sitting there very patiently. What are you thinking right now?
I mean, it's family central to us, but the construct of a family is different for us, I think. And so if we think about, and we often end up in this binary or this dichotomous world of one or the other, and I think it's a lot more complex than that. So when I think about, concepts such as holding, concept of holding our young men particularly, there are responsibilities, kinship responsibilities, to hold a nephew, for example, or someone within that kinship, that ecological structure, which isn't, it's not formulaic. I mean, it's our way of doing business, and it's been handed down through millennia. But I guess what I'm saying is that there are layers and layers on top of this. So absolutely families are critical. But the way that I think about my family is as much as what some might consider a surrogate family, my non-Indigenous family, the people in my street. My sister who lives in Hong Kong with two of my nephew and my niece who are Hong Kong-born children. They're a part of my family. I had a Malay father. He was from that era of the White Australia policy, a pearl diver who was indentured labour in this country. So I have a Malay family in Malaysia from his first marriage. So all of that's there, and the framing of me simply as an Indigenous person is insufficient as well. So these are the extra kind of layers on top of... so being reductionist, I think, in a policy sense, doesn't serve us well at all.
Yes. Do you think we do Indigenous policy well? Just trying to fire it.
Wasn't this about something easy like family?
Well, Indigenous family policy.
Let's face the facts. The policies that have ended up with us carrying a whole lot of cumulative intergenerational trauma were genocidal policies in this country. Let's just be clear about that. So Aboriginal families have got to rebuild, and what we're doing is looking back at our original teachings, our original learnings, our culture, the way in which we construct our worlds and our understandings of our world, to get to the next step. So a policy, the beautiful policy development process that we all, 101, is not going to deliver that for us. It's us actually as Aboriginal people saying, this is who we are, this is how we assert ourselves, and others, come on board with that journey.
Like owning the debate.
Absolutely, owning it, leading it, going beyond that frame. We talk about deficit.
Yeah.
The framing of Aboriginal people is dysfunctional, deficit, despair.
And are you hopeful that young Indigenous leaders are onto that in the same way that their ancestors, their grandparents are?
Well, it's tough. I've got 3 kids. Each and every one of them have been told that they're not Aboriginal. How could they be Aboriginal? That's the world that we face. With my kids, they learnt very early on. It was my responsibility to teach them anti-racism strategies, because we throw our kids into racist systems.
Yeah.
The education system, you look at that, the health systems. So we have to equip our kids, as all kids really. This isn't simply about race. But I've got a great deal of confidence, but we have to fight for that, because others will do the defining for us.
And I'll take the spotlight off you after this for a moment. But with your children, do they look back through your family, and what are the values that are really important for them to hold on to?
Well, I'm just thinking, Jono, who might pick me up from the airport next? Because that'll be the kid that loves me the most.
You set a new barometer.
Just carry your will with you wherever you go.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm willing to update at any
amendment,
point.
Amendment number 25.
Unless it's a mortgage. Yeah, so,
But look,
to them as young...
I mean, they know who they are,
Yeah.
where they come from. But my son, for example, so our kids are privileged kids. They've got working parents, tertiary educated parents, and there was an expectation that they would go on and, go to study or do whatever. But they've each and every one of them had to face being black in this country and all that comes with that. My son, for example, is studying architecture here in Melbourne. He had to take a year off because the cultural load that he carried, and he is, at his university, the only Aboriginal architecture student in that entire cohort. And he's teaching architecture lecturers and the faculty about Indigenous studies. This is ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's an offence and it's an insult at this day and age. But he had to take a year off, and I took him home back to Broome to get culturally strong again.
Right.
And so he's back into his studies this year, knowing who he is in a much
With that
stronger way.
connection.
Yeah.
Okay, so can I go to you, Benjamin, on the same thing, in the sense that when you were growing up, that those family values and that connection that you've really hung on to now, being quite a different person in a different world, and what you've eschewed, what you've,
Yeah, I mean, I grew up as an outsider in a lot of ways. Not that I ever actively felt excluded necessarily, but because I grew up in a particularly white part of Australia, my family always stood out, and I was always acutely aware that we did share some sort of fundamental values to the rest of our peers. Growing up in a Chinese Australian household and more broadly Asian Australian household, like education was super important. You were always kind of reminded of what your life could have been like if we hadn't moved to this country. And we were acutely aware of that because we knew our cousins, and, that parallel life is always presented to you as an acute possibility. Being lucky was something that we were very, very conscious of. But it was always family first, which makes me sound like a family first candidate. But it was always putting each other first. And even when, my parents' marriage broke down, it was really, really important to be there for each other. So I actually feel lucky because the other way in which I was an outsider was being gay. And as time goes on and I am more connected with the queer community and have more queer friends, I understand what a rare thing that actually is. And when we talk about family, one of the things that we often talk about in the queer community is our queer family as distinct from our blood family, because so many of us have experienced just such strong rejection from the... I mean, when you talk about that betrayal, Jono, what can be more kind of tearing in terms of your fabric of life than your family rejecting you for who you are? Jamila and I are both huge RuPaul's drag race fans. I don't know if anyone else watches the drag queen competition that is that show. It's very, very good. But one of the things that RuPaul often says is, as gay people and queer people more broadly, you sometimes have to make your own family.
Ben wins the panel for quoting RuPaul.
And when I was writing a quarterly essay last year about the Safe Schools scandal, one of the things that I really wanted to do was engage with young people for that story, because the Australian newspaper News Limited had written hundreds of thousands of words about safe schools, none of which was positive, and they'd failed to interview a single young person in a story that was ostensibly about young people. And so when you talk to young queer people in this country, you are starting to get kind of stories of hope and access to things that I didn't have access to when I was growing up, like a community. But you're still also getting stories of people rejected from their parents, increased rates of homelessness and dangerous behaviour because their families and their parents didn't take care of them.
And, you know, you've hit on something we've talked about so much in the last couple of days, you know, the importance of the child and the importance of hearing the voice of the child in policy and in research, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But, you know, Nora, you're kind of nodding through this. You're enjoying this conversation, I can tell. It's, you know, you've studied this and you're a world expert in this area. Was there something that led you into this study? Is there a reason you chose this?
Yes and no. I think we all bring parts of our family to whatever work we do. Thinking about growing up in a household where my dad worked very long hours, he was an executive, but when we went on vacation, he was on vacation, and we were totally 100% his focus.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I was much older that I realized that, and he shared a story with me, that when he went on vacation, he left an envelope on his desk that said, in case of emergency, contact me at this number. Now, this was long before cell phones and such, but he put the phone number in the envelope. One time he came back from vacation and the envelope had been opened, but there was a second envelope that said, I have complete faith in your ability to resolve just about any problem that you might have while I'm on vacation. In case of emergency, open the envelope and you can reach me. And he actually had 3 envelopes, and each one was further in support of his colleagues, but also stating very clearly that for this period of time, this is the focus. Yeah. And so, sort of reflecting back, it may have inadvertently led me to the work-family field, which I was in for 25 years. It may simply have just been one of those multiple elements in my experience that led me to want to study and understand this more.
So we've talked about how much we see our own families change and how much we've changed in a generation. And I was saying over lunch, my mother used to say to her 5 young children, you just wait till your father gets home. And yeah, we're all nodding. If I said that, that would just mean a later bedtime and more sweets. So, you know, even our roles within the family have changed. But if one thing has really helped that, it has to be technology. And Jono, I know you feel quite strongly here. You know, the influence on technology, how has it changed family?
Well, I think what it has changed is we often talk about digital natives, but this is actually the first generation of digital parents who are making up a lot of the rules as we go along, and we have no history of evidence to understand what's good and what's not, how much screen time, and even the fact that those generations are roughly only last for 3 years. So it's really now it is the challenge of parents with mobile phones, for example, or iPads. We are very fast moving into the voice activation era. So actually screen time may be an unimportant issue for a generation of parents within 5 years. Right? So what's happening, I think, with technology is that it is meaning every family is having to construct its own rules in the context of a series of devices that have amazing benefits and amazing risks, all built into a really easy UI, right? They're easy to access. So for the first time, if you think about it, of say, you know, a generation ago, access to pornography, it was actually quite a lot of effort for a kid to go about it, right? But actually now it's instantaneous. So it's actually the risk is still there, but it's been both amplified and made easier to access. So has been some of the safety resources. I think, you know, Ben was talking about this in terms of LGBTI community. I did actually the first Australian study 21 years ago looking at suicide in that case, young gay men. The biggest struggle that those young men spoke about was the sense that at school I'm the only one. Is there anyone like me in the world? And now you go online and there's lots of people just like you. So while everyone may feel like a freak in some way, there are at least freaks who are like me, no matter what that is. You know, and I think that, so what we're seeing then is a really special change to do with community, to do with identity, to do with risk.
Support.
And parents are really at the cutting edge of that. And I think the other thing that we just are starting to understand, probably tap into your knowledge in terms of a medical professional, but these devices are designed to be addictive. They have addiction built in to their makeup, which is why we all feel anxious when we don't have our phone in front of us. Right? What we know is that addiction centre in the brain develops in kids roughly between the age of about 4 and 14. And so we don't know how this stuff is just playing with how kids' brains develop. And I think that's, again, what parents are just trying to work out and get a little bit of advice on.
But or anecdotally, the evidence is that our teens are highly anxious. You look at every study that comes out. Are you tying that directly to technology use?
I think there's a correlation. I'm not convinced there's a causation.
All right. So can
because I think the other reason why our kids are anxious, and again, it's always dangerous to see one correlation and draw a causation. This is also the generation that grew up through the GFC, right? This is a generation, I actually think it makes complete sense as a generation that wants security, because the world was fundamentally broken in relation to trust. And what that generation saw was that rather than the world and particularly older people rally around them and wealth be redistributed, actually there's been a sharpening of wealth going towards those who already gamed the system.
Yeah.
Right? So if I'm a 16-year-old and going, actually, I'm not convinced I trust baby boomers to have my best interests at heart, because I saw that they broke the system. It was their generation that broke the system. I also saw that they got wealthier at the end of it, and I can't buy a house.
Yeah.
Right? So I think one of the things that we have to be careful of here is, how do young people view trust? Why are they conservative? Why are they anxious? And if I don't have a sense that those entrusted, the generation to entrust my best interests, actually have my best interests at heart, I'm probably getting a little bit anxious.
And is the correct research being done into those areas, or is there an opportunity for people sitting in this room?
I think there's a massive opportunity. I think the challenge isn't the lack of research, it's the speed of research. What I see is that, I doubt, and maybe there's a show of hands, is anyone working here on the risk to do with voice activation in how kids will navigate the world and how that will change their access to information? The number one most purchased device on Amazon Day was voice activation, the Amazon Echo. This will transform our world in the next 3 years.
Yeah.
Every 4-year-old will be able to talk to a device and navigate the world without any literacy.
And
So we need to understand, what does that mean for our kids, right? So that's when I talk about the speed of, you could be, understanding the impact of television, and I'm sure there's lots of people still researching the impact of screen time and television.
Yeah.
Yet our kids actually may not be screen-based within 3 years.
All right, so I want to come back to that policy opportunities in just a moment, but just can I ask you about instant gratification? Because that comes with the use of this.
Yeah.
And I was at a school in Western Australia a couple of weeks ago, and the wellbeing officer told me that they now can't calm children down because they will bring them down and they'll say, breathe for 30 seconds, breathe slowly. And if a child can't do that in 2 minutes, they panic more because they can't do it. Yeah. That our search for instant gratification in this generation is to the point where they almost can't operate on occasion.
Absolutely, I think that's true, and it's to do with mobile devices. It's also true for us. I don't know if anyone's seen, actually, this is a great experiment. You go to a restaurant and watch two people, and they both have their mobile phones on the table. And then one person gets up to go to the bathroom. Within 5 seconds, the other person reaches for the mobile phone. They cannot afford to be lonely for 5 seconds.
Well,
right? So I think that idea of instant gratification, my point is, our kids learn from us as well. We as a society are struggling with being bored. We are struggling with being inside our own heads.
Yes.
And when you put that on top of a kid who is, their brain are developing, and the way in which we develop our creativity is through boredom. And if our boredom can always be satisfied through instant gratification, then we're changing one of the fundamental kind of brain constructs, and we kind of don't know the other way around it. But it happens to us. It happens to me. I did it at lunch. I was thinking about this and went, oh, geez, I'm looking at my mobile phone while I'm thinking about how bad it is.
And I think Nora and I can almost beat that, can't we? Last night we went out for dinner and someone was brought a cake to 4 people at the table, and the 4 people at the table didn't even see the cake put down because they're all actually on their phone. So look, you've raised the issue of opportunities and what we as policymakers and researchers might actually be missing. And if over the last couple of days I came to write, from what everyone has said here, the vision for family policy in this country, Nora, you've come in. How would you describe it? Is there one in Australia from where you sit?
I think the potential is there. I think part of the conversation coming out of this event and the work that's being done at the Institute is making that possible. I think the language that we're evolving in the conversations around and about family is making it easier for us to come closer to that vision. You look at some of the videos and you look at what the kids are doing and the 10-year-olds are describing about life and what they're thinking about the future. I think it's very possible. I think it's going to require open minds. It's going to require warm hearts. It's going to require courageous conversation. It's going to require some uncomfortable moments for some people. It's going to require some humility. And it's going to require people to be patient and make mistakes.
In terms of research, I mean, we've heard consistently that the voice of children aren't heard. Do we in research need to ensure that in family policy we always make sure that children are involved?
Well, I think that it opens another question. Whenever we talk about family, we always sort of immediately slide into the outcomes for children.
Yes.
And yet we also have outcomes for adults, and we have outcomes for society, and we have outcomes for economy. And so if we begin to think about families not just as producers of children, but also as units of economic and social potential, then I think that we're in a better place.
So should we not so much focus on the family? Are we trying to fix the family when we should be trying to fix things like, for example, unemployment, which then gives economy to family?
I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's all of those things.
Yes.
And I don't think we all have to try to be experts in all of those elements, but we have to be willing to be open to hear ideas and stories. So yes, we have to include children in those conversations, not just because we can then check off the box and say we've done it, but because we really want to know what's making them anxious.
Yeah.
What is it that they're dreaming about? What is it they're looking at adults going, hey, put your phone down, Mom, I'm right here.
All right, so to you, Benjamin, who should then decide who does research and where it's aimed?
Look, I'm not a research expert, but when I spoke to research experts, say, looking at the experiences of LGBTIQ youth in this country, then of course you really have to engage young people and in good faith. And the research is there. I mean, when we broaden the conversation even further to say rainbow families, like 1 in 5 women in same-sex relationships are already raising children in this country. So that's already a reality. But what I think often we have in this country in terms of like policy discussion is we're trying to either retrofit or engineer policy to make something that we want to ideally have as a family rather than accommodate for the families that already exist. That really comes up over and over again, how so many different family structures and how many different family iterations feel disenfranchised and excluded from policy discussion because they're just simply not seen as family.
So taking up that and what Jono said, how do people in this room work out what is best to research? What makes it current and timely? How do we work out those issues that we need to look at? Who wants to take that?
I think it assumes that the people in this room have control of that agenda, right? I think we're as bigger at mercy to what are the grants going through, what do we think is politically expedient as anyone else. So I think this is where the dynamic is really important. And to Benjamin's point, I think if you involve children, particularly when you're making decisions about a 30-year investment cycle, you've got to understand what do they want the world to be like.
Yeah.
And I look at this actually interestingly in Australia's going on a road building binge. We're obsessed with roads. At the very time when all the data from kids say that driving cars is less important.
Yeah.
Right, so no one's asking kids, actually, in 30 years, when you've got billions of dollars of debt, do you actually want to use the very infrastructure that's there? And they're going, no. But it's being designed primarily by people of my age and older men whose idea of independence was the car.
Yeah.
So this is, I think, the challenge when you don't involve people who are, by and large, whether it be trying to design Indigenous policy and not co-designing it with members of the Indigenous community, or you're trying to co-design and understand what's important in the LGBTI community without involving them, is you inevitably get it wrong because you place your own values on top of their values and you just screw it up. Like that's, I think if there's one thing we don't need to research anymore, is that's what will happen.
And you made the point to me that, if you look at how much money or how much research we go into drink driving, for example, and with driverless cars, that will become less and less of an issue.
Yeah, we could have no drink driving issues within a decade.
Yeah.
Right? Not because we've done anything better on education, but it will be a combination of young people not driving very much, better public transport, and the driving that's there is largely done through automated vehicles and Uber. So, but there will be a different set of issues, and I think this is then the challenge for researchers co-designing with the community, saying, what do you want the world to be like? And how do we help design that and research that world to inform the policy that will be there for the world that you're inheriting from us?
Jamila?
I think, and this is slightly tangential, but I think something we also need to think about as when we're talking about researchers and then the ultimate decision maker, which is ultimately a political decision maker, is in this country, certainly at a federal level, we separate our politicians from their families, right? We're sitting here talking about family policy. I can't tell you that there is not a less family-friendly career than being a politician. I remember getting my itinerary back from Qantas at the end of 1 year spent as a staffer, and I had taken 247 flights in 365 days. Like, I was single and 25, didn't matter being on the road. But if you've got family, whether it's older parents who depend on you, if you've got children who depend on you, if you've got a partner, we are isolating our politicians and our ultimate decision makers often on the other side of the country and saying, now make decisions that are best for families. How are they supposed to do that? They've lost their connectedness to their own family.
And the fact that, Larissa Waters breastfeeding in the Senate was something that was so celebrated, which I thought was a great image, but it's kind of like, it's depressing that needs to be celebrated now, because it just shows you the extent to which women, and especially mothers, have been excluded from it, how difficult the structures in place, make it for you to access corridors of power.
And that's tough for a Queenslander, right? Imagine being from Western Australia. There's a reason that the very few women who sit in the Senate or the House of Representatives from Western Australia don't have children. There's a reason for that. There's a reason we've just lost a great Western Australian MP because he says, I miss my family too much.
Yeah. Rom, you're nodding in agreement, and you actually have two homes, don't you? You're a little bit... Just explain that.
So Canberra's the family home, but Melbourne is where I work. So I'm 4 years into this job. The first 2.5 years I commuted every week. I thought, you think about numbers and equity and trying to balance it all up, work-life balance, etc. So I had 3.5 days in Melbourne, 3.5 days in Canberra. And that just really drove me into the ground. So right now I spend a week in Melbourne, 5 days, 9 days back home if I'm not on the road. But that comes at a cost. Yeah. I've had our youngest child has just... youngest daughter has just finished year 12 this year. That was a really tough gig for all of us. Not to mention the kinds of things that we've talked about in terms of anxiety and a whole bunch of things. And I remember before being offered the job as the CEO of the Literature Institute, having the conversation with her about how she felt about a kind of part-time father, if you like. And this is where it gets very kind of painful in a sense is that she said, "Dad, I know that it's important for our people." And, kids shouldn't have to decide on that.
Yeah.
So these are the sorts of things, and I've got a good mate who said, every second generation of Aboriginal kids should just be able to be kids, not be Aboriginal kids, because you're born into this world as an Aboriginal kid. It's a political world from day one. And however active you are, whether you're an activist or you're dealing with it in a whole range of other ways, there's no escape for an Aboriginal kid.
And you just heard the nods of agreement, when you said that.
Yeah.
Nora, we also need our research and our policy to be whole, don't we? And you gave me the example of childcare, which was research and became policy on the basis of women going back to work. And then it was about the quality of childcare. Then it was about the affordability of childcare. How do we go about research in a better way and policy formation in a better way?
Well, I think we're further ahead than we've ever been by acknowledging the importance of research and data and analysis. I worry that we may have taken that too far, that only now we'll feel comfortable actually making policy or changing legislation if we have the evidence to back it up, when I think we also need to not just have evidence-based programming, but also evidence-informed and evidence-inspired. And then and only then can we be creative and innovative. And then we'll be able to really harness the strength of what's happening in our communities. Because families don't wait. Families are the most adaptable institution that we have. They don't wait for a childcare policy. If they need childcare, they're going to figure it out. Yeah. We can make it easier for them by providing affordable, high-quality, accessible care in their communities that is available to them in the time schedule that they require it, or they're going to figure it out themselves. And so there's sort of a balance between inspiring and informing programs and policies, and then having people help us understand what's working well and what's not working well. And I really believe that when you're doing the right thing for the right reasons, you're going to end up with the right results. If we try to squeeze and force and push, and we're not necessarily going to have the results that we need or that we want. But we have to be open to constantly tweaking. Families are constantly managing. I once heard somebody describe parenting as soon as you figure out how to handle a 3-year-old, they become 4. And you got to start all over again. Yeah. And then they're 14 before you know it. Yeah. And you've already had to learn and relearn and continuously learn. So I think the same is true with our policies and our programs. As soon as we get infant care right, we're going to have to change it because of technology or because of the labor market or because of the environment. And so we're going to have to be prepared to do that constantly.
And you also said to me that, our language we use is really important, the narrative. And the example is, what do our statistics, our research shows? The number of separations or divorces, the number of single parents, the number of unemployed. What would happen if we flipped that and we looked at the number of people who stay together, the number of people? Just talk to us about that importance of language and what it can mean.
Well, one quick example. We were having difficulty getting military families to participate in research. And we'd send out surveys and we'd try to engage them in focus groups, and they wouldn't participate. And this was when military families were considered to be part of furniture and effects. And they were seen as being needy and vulnerable and at risk, and the language was really negative. So what we did is we went out to the country and we asked them to complete the phrase, military families are, in one word. We wanted to be able to see how military families were perceived. And overwhelmingly, we got military families are courageous, resourceful, resilient, strong, powerful, important. And we went back to the military families and sort of held the mirror up and said, this is how you're seen in the country. And posture started to straighten and people felt better about it. And all of a sudden, when we started to change the framing, then people started participating because they wanted to be a part of that identity. They wanted to be a part of the solutions related to that. So we started, if it worked for military families, where else could it work if we began reframing and looking at things differently? Now, being a research organization, of course, you're always accused of being either half full or half empty, optimist or pessimist, left or right. The way we look at it is the glass is neither half full or not half empty. There's just too much glass. Let's just focus on what is. And if we understand what is without judgment in either direction, if we change the vessel, it's going to be completely different. Let's just focus on what is. And I think when we change the language that we use, even something as simple as the marriage failed, the couple broke up. No, they redefined their relationship. They evolved to a new stage in their life. They negotiated new roles and responsibilities. It may in fact strengthen a family unit when a divorce or separation occurs because the tension and the anxiety and the anger is dissipated.
So, Jamila, so much. And I want to go to your questions after this. So if you've got a question, get ready to put your hand up and I'll get a microphone to you. But Jamila, so many wonderful people in this room have done research. And a couple of people have said to me, so you do it, but what happens to it then? And so how do people in this room get what they do out there?
Yeah.
How is that what they do understood by the general public?
Yeah. We used to, when I worked in politics, we used to call this the divide in the office between the policy advisors who actually knew stuff and people like me who were the media and political advisors who actually knew how to talk to people about stuff. Yeah. And I think the first thing is acknowledging that you have a problem, friends. You are wonderful thinkers. You're not necessarily going to be wonderful communicators as well, just as I'm not a particularly wonderful thinker, good communicator. So recognising where your gaps are means that once you've done an outstanding piece of research with an interesting set of results, getting that into the hands of government in the first place takes a special kind of communication. Getting government to take that up takes a different kind of communication. And for government to make that popular in the community is another type of communication skills again. And recognising that the way you use your language when you engage with government and when you engage with media is also important. So being able to flip your thinking around and think, what is going to make this interesting and relevant and useful to the media today? What is going to make this relevant, interesting and useful to government today is really important. I know it feels impure, and it is. But in the end, if you have got a decent piece of research that you believe in, all you are doing is trying to make that heard. I'll give you a couple of really quick examples. In government, we used to speak all the time about quality childcare because that was the language the sector had given us. And that's what the researchers had given us, and that's what the early childhood sector had given us, and we used to talk about quality. And we finally sat down, I remember, in Kate Ellis's office one day and said, no one knows what the hell we mean. Like, what is quality childcare? What makes it quality? That word doesn't mean anything to parents. And we changed to safe and educational, and the results came so quickly. We were suddenly communicating with people about the same things we've been talking about for ages. The same amazing research that showed 90% of brain development happens in the first 5 years of life. This amazing research done by Australian researchers, we were able to communicate far more effectively with a really simple tweak of language. The second point I want to make is just about the media. There's so much wrong with the media right now. I cannot even get started. This week is a great example. Yeah. So much wrong with the media. But the one good thing about this obscenely fast media cycle and this obscenely hungry media cycle and the fact we click onto something for 2 seconds and click off means we are bloody desperate for content. We are so desperate for content. There has never been a better time to get interesting new research into the hands of journalists because where a journalist used to have to churn out 1 story a day, they are now expected to churn out 5, and we don't have that many ideas.
Yeah, look, and can I say, from another journalist, that was just a terrific piece of advice, and sometimes you've just got to hold your breath
need something to say.
and pick up the phone. All right, so please, lots of questions for our panel, and we're going to start here. If you've got a question, please raise your hand.
That's yours.
I'm quite new to this sector, so coming to this conference, I feel like I've come to a cocktail party that's been going on for quite a while. But I was interested with this idea that at the point that family is everybody in the community, does the Australian Institute of Family Studies become something more like the Australian Institute of Relationship Studies?
Anne, I think I'm going to bring the microphone to you here. Oh, yeah. She wanted dangerous ideas. Why don't I go to Nora here? Is there value? Is there value in the AIFS thinking like that?
I think, it's one of those things that if you give it up, you may lose it forever. If it's a lot like when work and family became work and life, and all of a sudden we lost family, and you lose a lot. There are a lot of relationships. You can go in that direction. It's like deciding that you want to come up with a policy for seniors versus a policy related to aging. Both are very important, but very different. And I think losing family, when there's so few of us that still use the language and keep the focus, I think it would be unfortunate. But you're absolutely right. Relationships are at the core. And it's about the connections. It's about the interdependence. It's about those who have strong connections and those that don't.
Okay, and we might come to the new relationships we're seeing in families in just a moment, but Carrie's got a question.
Hi, my name's Carrie. Look, I'll just say I'm a mum. It took me 15 years to become a mum. I'm not biologically my daughter's mother. And I had a fantastic person carry my child for me, and a fantastic egg donor. The process was incredibly difficult, mental health-wise, relationship-wise, societal assumptions about the process. So my question just sort of comes from and touches on a lot of things about the idea of family. Same-sex couples, government policy, which is so behind what the modern-day family makeup is, to the point where in my own workplace I became a precedent in getting maternity leave because I didn't physically bear a child. Also just sort of around that, when is policy going to catch up with this ever-changing concept of what a family and what a parent is, and also broader social perceptions about that.
I think that's going to happen, and I think it's happening very quietly and one sort of pebble at a time. This isn't something that's going to be a massive new policy or program. There's going to be a little bit of precedent, like you just made one little move that's going to make it easier for the next one to come after you and beyond. In Canada, we now have one province that allows you to have 5 names on a birth certificate. Wow. The sperm donor, the egg donor, the surrogate, the parent 1, parent 2. And you can all actually be identified on the birth certificate. It's a little step, but it's one of those wedge items that allow us to get one step further and another step further.
And Benjamin, can I ask you to join that answer too? Because I think the same-sex marriage debate was a little bit like that too. The public were already there, and a lot of very good people had to go through a lot of heartache for the government to accept the public were there.
I mean, this is maybe even a broader discussion about how little our parliamentarians, like the makeup of Australian Parliament, actually reflects the community. And that's on almost every metric, gender, age, ethnic background, you name it. Like, it's kind of like dominated by a very, very strong monoculture. And I think as a result, and maybe this is speaking more broadly, it really feels like ideology often trumps research. And that's why this communication is really, really important to kind of like break through that ideology is really, really difficult. And, just to give another example, which is kind of tangential to this, but, Safe Schools, which was a very cheap program, like it was $8 million over 3 years, launched by the Abbott government, by the way, versus the school chaplaincy program, which is like over $200 million over 4 years. And Safe Schools was actually something that was requested by principals and teachers across the nation, but because there came to be a backbench in the government that was very, let's just say it, homophobic, that kind of great research that was done by independent experts and academics in their bank of knowledge gets completely undermined. And that's how quickly something like that can happen, And when Jamila talks about a weird media environment that we're inhabiting at the moment, like that's part of it as well, like how quickly those stories can really catch on and public sentiment can kind of race on with that ideology as well. I'm not painting a very optimistic picture, I know.
No, but you are in the sense that if we speak out and tell our stories, so if, for example, in education, it's only in the last couple of years that principals and teachers have actually stood up and spoken out, whether it's on the ATAR system or child wellbeing. And what you and Jamila are saying is, if your story's worth telling, it's worth hearing.
Yeah.
And we all know policy is more inclined to be developed on the peak hour bus in Melbourne traffic than it is in Parliament.
Just to build on that, because I think this is a critical point, which is you have to fight for your rights.
And keep fighting.
And I think what the debate last year showed more than anything else is how a minority of people projected the idea that they were the majority and were shown to be wrong. Right? Yeah. And I think the risk is if you don't follow Jamila's advice, you don't get in the game. Yeah. And those who are better at communicating create the perception that they're the dominant view. Right? And I'll use this from two campaigns. The one that most people will be aware of is a group of organisations, including Reach Out, got together around the marriage equality debate and formed a campaign called Mind the Facts. And we did it very, very particularly because, and the main line was, if we vote yes, 3,000 lives will be saved. Built on research, but it was an amazing line in the media. Yeah. Right? And it was very clearly targeted at the people we knew who thought that their vote didn't matter. Yeah. Right? The group that was actually going to sway things. It was like, I don't care about it. I just want them to get out of my life. Yeah. But I'm pretty happy if they have a good life, good luck to them. Right? Yeah. That was a pretty large group. But then they said, actually, if this can save someone's life, maybe a yes vote will kind of tip me the other that way. And I think that shows you the coming together of very specific research, a willingness to put our credibility on the line as mental health organisations and defend it against, in that case, Andrew Bolt. And then a willingness to not be general with our research. And what that does is actually means you are coming together to say, we got the win that we wanted to see. We played a very small part in that, but you've got to be better at comms, and it works. Yeah.
The other thing I'd just add to that on the power of stories is that the single thing that changes people's mind in a way that nothing else does, data, research, evidence, nothing compares to someone you know and you care about. Nothing. That is more compelling to change your mind on something than anything. I'll give you a really brief example. My dad's a fairly moderate kind of guy, has worked in government for a long time. I would call him socially conservative. And 10 years ago, if I'd asked him about marriage equality, he would have been, yeah, sure, absolutely. But if I said, what do you think about a gay couple having children? He would go, oh. And he'd suddenly be concerned, right? My little boys, fairy godfathers, we call them, self-named, in the process of having a child at the moment. And my dad is thrilled. He is thrilled and has said again and again, God, they're going to be good parents, which is just true. But because he knows them, all his fears have dissipated. Yeah. And the power of telling stories is that even if I don't know someone personally, if a story is told well and beautifully and compellingly on the radio or on television, I'm going to relate to that person because they're a real person, not just a stat.
A great comment. Our next question, James.
Should researchers strive to be apolitical? Should we keep our cards very close to our chest in order to be able to communicate and engage with all sides of politics?
Nora, do you want to take the lead there?
Well, I think it's important for researchers to stay in their lane. I think it's really important for researchers to learn how to pass the baton. This really is a relay. Be good at what you do it really well. Don't be afraid to take it to the finish line. Don't be inauthentic in your observations. But I think where researchers can sometimes get into trouble is when it becomes political. And if you've got the right message and you've got the right data, then let other people take it to the political. But for a research education organization, we take people right up to the line. We tell the stories. We let them know if they choose A, they're going to get this result. If they're going to choose B path, they're going to get this result. Then we leave it up to the advocates to take it thereafter. Otherwise, we start getting questioned about how trustworthy is our data. And so we never try to go beyond that. You can't not be who you are, but to stay really clean, I think adds credibility and adds weight to everything that researchers do. But don't be afraid to pass the baton to those either the advocates or the communications people or the media, and plan on when you're going to make that transfer.
Can I ask Rom, what are you thinking there?
I mean, I've got a bit of a different view. And you'll often hear the refrain from Aboriginal people saying that we're the most researched people on earth. And what that says is that there's the way in which research has been constructed and the dominance of the Western system over our Indigenous knowledges has been at the detriment for our people. So this is not actually saying, be skilled in research, do your training, etc. But at the Lowitja Institute, we're absolutely clear. Our research principles are very clear about benefit to our people, impact for our people, leadership by our people, translation, building in translation so that we can mitigate against this notion that researchers somehow go out and do their business and then someone else picks up the narrative and the translational aspects to then try and convince policymakers. So we're right at the start. A researcher will not get the full amount of funding through our institute without having a knowledge translation plan that has community direction embedded within it. So this is our approach to research. And so in a sense, it's inherently political. Our researchers at the Lowitja Institute, 87% of our chief investigators are black, in our small funding that we administer. The NHMRC, National Health and Medical Research Council, have a nominal allocation of 5% of their funds, a target for Aboriginal research. It's the flip side of what we've achieved. 12.5% of their research chief investigator, their chief investigators are black. So if we start to think about how do we build capacity, capability for our people, where's the leadership, that kind of speaks volumes. So we're in an intrinsically political space and we understand that space, but we privilege our people first and foremost.
And as long as accountability is a part of that and transparency, it helps advocacy.
Well, I'd flip the question about where's the accountability by non-Indigenous researchers and research systems and policymakers around centring policies around Aboriginal people.
Yeah. Now, Jono, did you want to add before I go to the next question? No? Okay, thank you. Catherine.
I think that one of the things we haven't heard in this discussion this afternoon is any focus on child-centred behaviour, and that no matter what the structure of the family is or the people that care for that young person, if we, we don't have a child-centred world now. We don't, raising children is something that, we're sort of part of some industrial thing, and raising children is something you do in your spare time, and yet it is the most important thing that we'll do. and it's not just the responsibility of parents. So I guess I'd like to hear people's ideas about what the answer to the question is. What do we have to do so we can hold our young people and grow them up in a way that makes them thrive, but also be able to grow up their children and their grandchildren?
I'll ask Jamila what you're doing and then go to Jono.
Yeah. I'm speaking very much from a personal perspective, but most of the work that I do is around gender and gender equality. And one of the things we've seen happen over the last 40 years is this huge influx of women into the workforce, which has fundamentally been a good thing. What we haven't seen is a whole lot of men leaving. And I'm not saying that in the get the men out, but get out. But and our economy has adapted in the same way. Our economy has then adapted to assume that a family requires, to have a family living and living well, requires 2 incomes, which means that often the care of children is suddenly a gap. For most families, certainly most families I know that most of my friends have kids under 5 if they've got children, and most of us have 2 parents working full time. And that gives you a new set of challenges. And whether it's dependence on grandparents for help, wish I had some damn grandparents in this city, or whether it's childcare for help, or whether it's some other form, I think increasingly the economic comes before the care of children in that sense. And I think our assumption that grandparents will continue to pick up that load and fill that gap in an unpaid way, I don't think is an assumption that will hold.
Jono?
I agree with all that, and I actually, look, as a guy with 3 kids, I agree we should get out, and I think one of the challenges of if you look at the story around family policy in this country, it has been obsessed with women. It's been obsessed with women's flexibility, women's employment, childcare and women, and there is very little conversation that then says to the guys, get out.
But there's also a stigma towards, especially
hugely.
heterosexual men.
And you see that in the sensation, and I'll say this as a dad, that you often go to the school gates and not sure who to talk to because it's not your world, right? And so there's a sense of you always have to be invited into places if you don't feel a sense of ownership over those places. So for the very reason that, many people and many women have felt like the workplace I haven't owned that space. I've got to be invited in and all that flexibility. I think this will be the opportunity with this next generation to start helping everybody play different roles as defined by what's right for their particular unit, right? And it could be current traditional role, it could be the reverse role. But until we actually start trying to work out how all carers of those kids, however, feel a sense that they can move between employment and family life, I think it's going to be tricky. And I think that's going back to that thing around Parliament, that's the weirdness of Parliament, of that we're only obsessed by women parents in Parliament.
Okay.
Right?
So,
Bill Shorten's kids are roughly the same age as Tanya Plibersek's kids, but we're only interested in her parenting responsibilities, not his parenting responsibilities. And it shows you that dichotomy. I think the one thing I've done in our organisation to finish this off is we have lots of toys around our office. My kids are probably in the office and feel far more entitled than anyone else in the office to run the show. And part of that for me is that we wanted it to be a communication that all parents and anyone with kids in their lives have a responsibility to bring those kids into the workplace, and it's changed a lot of the dynamics around some of the questions I think you're raising.
Okay, can I just ask one more question on that before we go on to our next question? And Nora, Anne mentioned a book on fathers and daughters that I've just penned, and that was an overwhelming theme, that men feel like suspects a little bit. Some fathers said they feel like there's a glass ceiling at home in the same way that their partners, who they love, feel it in the workplace. Principals said, you know, our protectionist policies mean we can't just let men roam around the playground as women. And, you know, and a big boss said to me, you know, I'm at fault. I see women as mums first and workers second, but I always see the men as workers first and dads second. Is that something that Canada has experienced, or is that something specifically Australian?
Oh no, that's global. That's. I would say it's happening in the Western world everywhere. I think, though, that this generation of new dads are redefining fatherhood. They're doing so in part because their partners are allowing them to redefine that. I can remember doing a workshop once with, it was a work and family workshop, and we were talking about sharing household responsibilities and how men were saying, you know, they're trying to do laundry, but the women just won't let them. And this one woman said, yep, he was doing laundry and he was folding the T-shirts this way instead of this way, and there was a crease down the front, so I divorced him. And it was the tension around how things get done was just being magnified.
Because there's a lot of ownership there.
So it requires both. But what we are seeing with the boomer grandfathers is that they're becoming very jealous of their boomer sons, or their Nexus and millennial sons, who are able to be full-time dads and be dads first and employees second.
And I think one thing that builds on that is I hear a common term across my friends, which is working mum. I'm a working mum. Yeah. You're a working. I'm in fact, I can't imagine a time where I said you're a working dad, or I'm a working dad. Right? Yeah. We don't get to claim the working dad title. Right? It's not our title. It's just assumed that we are a CEO or a thing, or we're a dad, as if they are two differential identities. And I think one of those things is, I'm fascinated. I ask my friends, like, why do you need to tell me you're a working mum? Like, what's the assumption that I have? But what do you think that kind of means to me? Because I don't feel a need to tell you that I'm a working dad. So I'm fascinated in, but it does show you how this this challenge, I think, generational challenge, is working its way through.
Okay.
And the opportunity there.
Let's go to our next question. Thanks, sir.
Hello, it's Philip Spratt here from the Australian Council of State School Organisations again. I was actually privileged to be part of the steering committee for the Safe Schools Coalition of Australia, but also to pay my respect to the staff of the Foundation of Young Australians behind that, because they were the kindest, most professional people I've ever come across. And all the opprobrium they face, never one unkind word passed their lips. And yet I look at Australia where we are now, and we have the rise of populism. Well, I take your point about, you know, people get a voice if people like and trust them, but I'm not quite sure where that came from in terms of the rise of One Nation and Australian Conservatives. They're obviously in the wane. And we see the rise of populism in the United States and other elements within the world. And yet, if you look at the last British general election, there was a sort of generational mismatch between one side of politics looking at supporting the youth side of things and the other looking at the older generation. And yet we have a general election coming probably within the next 12 to 18 months. So how can we go about ensuring a fair and reasonable and respectful debate that doesn't revolve around getting knife-edge differences in voting preferences that's going to put the young against the old? How can we actually see the researchers put better policy into the political debate?
I'm going to ask Benjamin to take that, and just Benjamin, so we can have one last question. And just using your experience in both the same-sex debate and the safe schools, what would you advise?
Well, before I talk about safe schools, I think one of the hats that I wear is interviewing prominent people for Good Weekend magazine, for Fairfax, now known as Nine.
Welcome. Welcome to our stable.
One of the people who I last interviewed, who will be coming up in a future issue, is Ken Wyatt, who's the first Indigenous Member of Parliament, and he's on the Liberal side. And I asked him, Ken, you're a pioneering Member of Parliament because, as an Indigenous person, but why doesn't Parliament reflect the Australian community? What's your theory? And he was like, well, it's the selection process. There is this still in how people access power. There is still a lot of nepotism, and Parliament's still a boys' club, and especially on certain sides of government, you're going to tend to gear towards people who look like you, share your values, and often belong to the same family. So that's the first thing. There needs to be some sort of circuit breaker. Like, for instance, the Liberal Party, they have identified that they have a gender gap problem. What are they actually going to do about it? They don't know. Hopefully something will naturally correct itself, which you'd think, over decades it would have done by now, but that hasn't. When it comes to, safe schools and the great work that Foundation of Young Australians have done, I think that whole story is a warning. That's a story about how good work built over years of bipartisan goodwill can quickly unravel in this country, and how a program that was launched essentially by conservative governments can be unravelled by a minority of very loud people willing to perpetuate a story built on falsehoods. Yeah. So when it comes to, policy, implementing policy and conveying that policy to the people who matter, you need to make sure that your message is clear and right. Even though arguably, the people and the main stakeholders in Safe Schools did, it was really, really hard to break through a really despicable chorus of people with a nefarious agenda. I'm not sure if that's the most optimistic
you said it very
note to
nicely,
leave it
I
on.
would have thought. Look, we're drawing to an end, but there's one issue that Nora's mentioned and a couple of questions came up, the issue of relationships. And can I just ask you, Nora, in terms of cutting-edge research or what you are seeing, how is relationships changing from kids to their grandparents or, in terms of the modern family? What's some stuff we don't know?
So you started with a tough question, now you're ending with a tough question. It's a big question. I think the beauty today, because we have the technology, because we have the diversity, we have the language, we're able to look at relationships and look at the way in which we connect with each other and hopefully guide that into a way that's positive and healthy. Maybe at times uncomfortable, but I think being able to engage in those conversations will be critical. And I think the big shift is going, especially from public policy, from a doing to a being. And we had 3 phases of doing. We're going to do to you, and then we're going to do for you, and then slowly we've moved into we're going to do this with you. And we need to take it the next step, and we need to go to being. We need to be respectful. We need to be inclusive. We need to be honoring. We need to be responsive. And then we'll be able to achieve everything that we've been talking about for the last 2 days.
All right, so let me ask each of you the same final question, and we'll start with Nora and just go down. If you were in charge of family policy or whatever one piece of research that you think could add to public debate, so Prime Minister for the day or whatever you like, what would you advise people in this room to focus on?
I think start with something that you know is going to resonate with the most people, with the most positive messaging that will build momentum to the next one. And there is no, I want childcare, I want housing, or I want anti-violence or anti-poverty. It's take the step that's going to get you the best results to build the momentum for the next. Not always the biggest thing, but the one that's going to give you the most energy to take it to the next step.
And I can see a number of people nodding. Benjamin, you don't know how scared I am even saying if Benjamin Law was Prime Minister for a day.
You should be. Let me all tell you how to do your job. No. I'm just going to take like a personal example of something, but more broadly, we always talk about diversity, and that's often framed within ethnic and cultural terms. And that's important because we're a nation where 1 in 4 of us are immigrants, 1 in 5 of us speak languages other than English at home. That's really important. But, 1 in 5 of us have significant disabilities, whether they're conspicuous and obvious or not. I think one of the things I'd really like to see is, this whole question of how do we accommodate all these different types of families is a really, really big one. But I think the first thing that we all need to do is simply contribute, whether it's through research, through the conversation, or through advocacy. Recently, I was helping a mate launch his book, and it's his childhood memoir about growing up as the only child of a single mother in regional Tasmania, and his mother had schizophrenia. And that seems like such a specific story, but then it gave me this whole new vocabulary of child carers. You know, that's a very particular issue and community within Australia that he definitely didn't have the support that he needed, but now he's tapped into a community where he can kind of be a role model and spokesperson for these younger people. So whatever community you're helping to support, you know, contribute in that way.
Terrific words. Jamila?
I'm on the Prime Minister for a day one. If I was Malcolm Turnbull, I'd be getting rid of Peter Dutton.
Yes.
So that's my answer on that one. For personal political reasons and for the good of the nation.
Yeah. And for the good of families, by the way, as well.
And for the good of families.
Yeah.
Good of everyone.
Yeah.
For the better opinion of potatoes, all of that. But moving more seriously to the research space, I think the sort of research that I've been looking for from a media perspective for a while to tell a story that I've been seeing emerge that doesn't seem to be out there is about the families that we start to form outside of romantic and sexual relationships and the results of those. And I'm talking about the families that we start to form when our partner dies later in life. And the way we put together, more and more I'm seeing my mother's friends and her contemporaries who've lost a partner and who are going to live for a long time. They don't necessarily want a new romantic partner, but they're forming more families amongst themselves. I spent 8 years living in the same share house. Lots of different share houses, same group. The three of us went into that share house as children, and we came out as adults with the partners we've ended up with for life, that we have had or will have children with. Those relationships, to me, are as strong as any family member, if not stronger, and they will see me through my whole life. We used to refer to ourselves as the Gen Y family, but that idea of housemates, because now people live as single people outside of the family home for so much longer, I think that's a relationship we haven't explored enough yet. So I think there are all these new relationships and new families that are starting to form that I think are worthy of some research and some interest.
Terrific. Rom?
I mean, mine's pretty obvious. I would open the doors to Parliament and do my job as a Prime Minister to bring about constitutional reform and back the Uluru Statement from the heart.
Yeah.
And that's about the nation. That's actually about the nation, because core to that is about sorting through the lies and the guilt and the untruths of this nation, so that we can actually take it forward as a nation.
Yeah. Thank you. Jono?
I'd actually back Rom's earlier point, which is get in the game. It's an inherently political space. If you don't occupy that space, someone else will. And if you cede the space of what families are and what good policy is, I guarantee you those with far less intelligence and those with far less research will claim it and will create a narrative that will decide where money goes.
Yeah.
And I think, so the challenge that you've got here, I think, is that what you've heard here is some great communicators, but also if some very, very brave people who've been willing to put the veracity of their integrity on the line and say, this is right, and I know this is right because I have a body of research and I have a body of opinion behind me that's really solid, and I'm willing to go toe-to-toe even if that takes a long time. And I think we've seen that in climate change, we've seen that in reconciliation, we've seen that in this space. So unless you develop that muscle, I think what you will find is the ground is ceded to those who design outcomes that your research and your experience will tell you is not good for people.
And I think we end these few days with an enormous sense of optimism too, because you only have to look around this room and the jobs that everyone in this room does, and you don't do it for money, you do it for the heart and to make a difference. And we've seen in so many different ways over the last couple of days that we certainly are in good hands. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please thank our terrific panel?
Thank you, Madonna.